Welcome to another episode of 8 Digital Podcast. Today we are turning our focus from the Iran-Israel war to a major political shakeup in the United States. A young left-wing candidate, Zohran Mamdani, is now poised to become the Democratic nominee for New York City mayor after delivering a stunning upset in the primary election.
It really is stunning.
The 33-year-old socialist declared victory on Tuesday, defeating his main rival, former state governor Andrew Cuomo, in what many are calling a generational and ideological shift in New York politics.
Yeah, a big one.
So we're going to unpack the dynamics of this primary election today, really look at what it signals for the future of politics, particularly in New York.
Sounds good. There's a lot to dig into.
Okay, so let's start with the person at the center of it all, Zohran Mamdani. Who is he? He's young, 33, a state assembly member since 2021.
Right.
Relatively new on the scene for many people, right?
Right, yeah. Relatively new in terms of holding office, but his background is really quite unique and seems central to his appeal. He was born in Uganda, his parents are of Indian heritage, and he moved to New York when he was about 7. Okay.
And his family background is pretty notable, too. His mother is Mira Nair, the filmmaker.
Oh, wow, the director.
Exactly. And his father, Mahmoud Mamdani, is a professor at Columbia. So, he grew up straddling different worlds, immigrant communities, intellectual circles in New York. It gives him a particular perspective, I think.
Yeah, that makes sense. A mix of global and very local New York experiences.
Precisely.
And politically, he calls himself a democratic socialist. That's a label with a lot of weight, especially in New York City.
It absolutely is. And if he wins the general election, the significance is huge. He'd be the city's first Muslim mayor and the first Indian-American mayor.
That's really breaking barriers, isn't it? For a city as diverse as New York, that's quite something.
Monumental, really. It signals a real shift in representation.
So what about his actual politics, his platform? We know the label, but what does he stand for?
Well, it's an unapologetically progressive platform. One of the most discussed and maybe most contentious parts has been his strong support for Palestinian human rights. Right, that's definitely drawn attention. And criticism, too, hasn't it? Accusations of anti-Semitism.
Yes, absolutely. It's created a very charged atmosphere around him. But on the flip side, that stance has really resonated with the progressive wing of the Democrats, and especially with younger voters who are critical of U.S. policy regarding Israel and Gaza.
So it cuts both ways. Mobilizing for some, alienating for others.
Exactly. It became a defining issue, and it showed he wasn't afraid to tackle these really tough, polarizing topics.
And how did he respond to those criticisms? Did he address the anti-Semitism concerns directly?
He did. He affirmed Israel's right to exist, but also stressed its responsibility under international law. And policy-wise, he proposed creating a new Department of Community Safety in the city.
Okay.
And specifically responding to anti-Semitic violence, he talked about boosting funding for anti-hate crime programs by, I think it was 800%. A huge increase.
Wow, 800%. So trying to offer concrete local solutions alongside those broader political stances.
Seems that way, trying to bridge that gap. But the intensity around this is real. He's received threats, been called awful names like terrorist, threats against his life, his family.
Jeez. That just shows how high the stakes feel for people and how vicious politics can get.
Yeah, it underscores the polarization. His identity and stances evoke really strong reactions, both positive and negative.
Okay, so we have this candidate, young, progressive, unique background, facing intense scrutiny. How did he actually win? How did he pull off this upset against Andrew Cuomo, a political heavyweight? Let's get into the blueprint.
Right. I think a huge part was his core message. It really drilled down on the idea that the mayor can directly lower the cost of living for New Yorkers.
That's a message that would land, wouldn't it? Especially in New York City right now.
Absolutely. It's a top concern for almost everyone. And crucially, it wasn't just talk. He backed it up with very specific, detailed policy proposals. It wasn't vague promises.
Okay, like what? What were the key proposals?
Well, first, a rent freeze. An immediate one for the, over 2 million tenants in rent-stabilized apartments?
Immediate relief.
Yeah. And economists, they often point out that stabilizing rent helps prevent homelessness, which ends up costing the public more anyway. Plus, he coupled that with a longer-term plan to build at least 200,000 more rent-stabilized and public housing units, tackling supply, too.
So addressing both the immediate crisis and the long-term shortage makes sense. What else?
Fare free public transit was another big one.
Ah, yes, I remember hearing about that. Building on pilot programs.
Exactly. Those pilots showed pretty positive results, increased ridership, something like over 30% on buses.
Wow.
And importantly, fewer assaults on bus drivers because there were no fare disputes. And, real savings for low-income New Yorkers.
So framing it as practical, efficient, and equitable.
Right. Then there was universal, no-cost childcare.
Okay, another huge cost for families.
Huge. He framed it as essential for gender equity, obviously, but also just basic economics. Getting parents, especially women, back into the workforce, creating good jobs in the care sector.
The return on investment for quality childcare is usually pretty high, isn't it?
It consistently shown to be, yeah. It pays dividends for the whole economy.
And I remember something about groceries. City-owned grocery stores. That sounds different.
It is innovative, a public option for groceries. The idea is to use the city's buying power to get healthy food into neighborhoods, especially food deserts, at affordable prices, basically competing with the big chains to bring costs down.
Interesting, like a direct intervention.
Yeah.
And worker protections, too.
Yep. Raising the minimum wage, regulating gig companies like DoorDash, better protections for delivery workers. It was a really comprehensive package aimed at, making life more affordable.
Okay, the big question then, how did he propose paying for all this? These were ambitious plans.
They are. The funding plan was also quite specific. Two main things: raising the corporate tax rate pretty significantly from 7.25% up to 11.5%, and adding a 2% income tax, but only on residents earning over $1 million a year.
So, targeting corporations and the highest earners, that itself is a clear political statement.
Absolutely. It's central to the whole coherent agenda argument, shifting the tax burden.
Policy aside, though, how did the campaign itself work? You can have great ideas, but you need to reach voters. What was the ground game like?
It sounds like it was incredible. Described as really energetic, powered by this massive volunteer canvassing operation. They mentioned over 50,000 volunteers.
50,000. For a city race, that's enormous. Unprecedented, really.
That's the word people are using, unprecedented. They were seemingly everywhere, knocking on doors, having conversations. Real grassroots stuff.
And what about reaching people online or through media?
Very savvy there, too. They used social media effectively, put out these really well-produced videos. And crucially, they did targeted outreach, campaign stuff entirely in Urdu.
Urdu? Wow.
Yeah, mixing in Bollywood clips, apparently. And Mamdani speaking Spanish in other videos. Really culturally specific outreach.
That must have helped break through, especially with communities that maybe feel ignored by traditional campaigns, like the Asian American voters you mentioned earlier.
Exactly. It challenged that stereotype of Asian Americans being unlikely voters. They showed up, and this kind of targeted outreach was likely a big reason why.
And there was some strategic stuff with the voting system too, right? Ranked choice voting.
Yes, that played a role. He had a cross-endorsement deal with Brad Lander, who came in third. That meant Mamdani likely picked up a lot of second-choice votes from Lander supporters as the count progressed. Smart strategy.
Okay, so you have this energetic, policy-driven, grassroots campaign with smart outreach. How did that contrast with Andrew Cuomo's campaign?
Stark contrast, really. Mamdani was all about this optimistic vision. We can make things better, lower costs. Cuomo's message was much more about the city being threatening, out of control, needing an experienced hand to restore order.
So hope versus fear, almost. Or maybe aspiration versus restoration.
Something like that. And Mamdani directly attacked Cuomo's record, the sexual harassment scandal, obviously.
Right, the reason he resigned.
Yeah. And the handling of COVID nursing home deaths. Plus, older criticisms diverting funds from the MTA, cutting public employee benefits. He painted Cuomo as part of a long-broken political system.
Positioning himself as the change candidate against the embodiment of the establishment.
Precisely. For voters fed up with the status quo, Mamdani offered a clear alternative.
Okay, let's look at the results themselves and what they tell us about this ideological and generational shift people are talking about in the New York Democratic Party. The first choice numbers were Mamdani 43.5%, Cuomo 36.4%. A solid lead.
A very solid lead. And the geography is interesting, too. Mamdani won big across Queens, Brooklyn, large parts of Manhattan, the more diverse progressive boroughs. Cuomo took the Bronx and Staten Island, which tend to be a bit more moderate or traditional Dem areas.
And even though he didn't hit 50% on the first round, the ranked choice system means he's pretty much guaranteed the win, right?
Exactly. With that kind of lead, as the lower candidates' votes get redistributed, he's almost certain to cross the 50% threshold. It's considered all but assured.
And the turnout you mentioned, it was up Significantly.
Yeah, over 980,000 Democrats voted. That's up at least 5% from 2021, and the highest turnout for a Democratic mayoral primary since 1989.
Wow. So people were really engaged this time.
Definitely shows increased enthusiasm or maybe increased urgency.
So who were these voters? What does the coalition that elected Mamdani look like?
It seems to be a mix. Clearly, the party's progressive wing turned out in force, and
Yeah.
younger voters were a huge factor.
Okay.
But also, as we touched on, specific demographic groups played a key role. Asian American voters were crucial.
Right, the fastest growing group in the city.
Mm.
Almost 18% of the population now.
Something like that, yeah. And their turnout in local elections has been climbing steadily. Over 27% of eligible Asian voters participated in the 2021 primary, which was a record high. They're becoming a really decisive force.
And Mamdani specifically appealed to them.
Seems so. Particularly South Asian voters in Queens, apparently motivated by the chance to elect the city's first mayor of Asian descent. Plus, he won Latino neighborhoods in Queens, too, likely helped by that Spanish-language outreach.
So it sounds like a coalition of progressives, young people, and specific, energized minority communities who felt seen and heard by his campaign. Fed up with the establishment, looking for change, focused on affordability.
That seems to be the picture, yeah. The new voice resonated.
What does this mean for the wider Democratic Party, maybe even nationally? Is this New York result part of a bigger trend?
I think it is. We're seeing progressives gaining more power at the local level and other places, too. You mentioned Brandon Johnson winning in Chicago.
Right.
Progressive majorities in places like St. Louis. It looked like a deliberate bottom-up strategy.
Building power locally when things are maybe stalled at the federal level?
Exactly. Build a bench of leaders. Push policy like minimum wage increases locally. Mamdani's campaign, the grassroots organizing, the culturally specific outreach, could really be a blueprint for progressives elsewhere, maybe even globally.
Building from the ground up. Interesting. Okay, let's flip back to Andrew Cuomo. This defeat must be a huge blow, especially given his attempt at a comeback. Remind us of the baggage he was carrying into this race.
Oh, it was substantial. The biggest thing, obviously, was the sexual harassment report from the Attorney General that led to his resignation in 2021.
Right, that hung over everything.
Definitely. Then there were the accusations about covering up COVID nursing home deaths, long-standing criticisms about his handling of the MTA, the transit system, cuts to public worker benefits, homeless services funding. It was a long list.
Did he ever really address those things convincingly?
Well, he maintained his innocence on the harassment, said he didn't intentionally harass anyone, and framed some issues as political attacks. But for many voters, the damage was clearly done. The trust wasn't there.
And yet, his campaign had serious money and big endorsements, right? Bill Clinton, a $25 million super PAC.
Yeah, massive resources. He definitely had establishment backing, wealthy donors. He campaigned on his experience, tried to talk tough on Trump, but maybe he misread the room on what voters cared about most.
Right.
The focus seemed less on that core affordability issue that Mamdani hammered.
And the result?
Yeah.
Being called the biggest upset in modern NYC history. That's got to sting.
Hugely embarrassing, yeah. Especially given the money and the name recognition, losing like this after being governor for so long, it's a dramatic fall.
And conceding before the final ranked choice count even finished, that really underscores how decisive the loss was. No path back.
None at all. It showed the margin was just too wide. It's being seen as a total repudiation.
So how is this being interpreted more broadly? A humiliating moment, a political earthquake.
Those are the terms being used. A real sign of a generational and ideological shift. Some analysts are saying it shows New York Democrats want leaders with enthusiasm and courage, maybe, not just experience or establishment ties, especially when it comes to confronting figures like Trump. They want fighters, perhaps.
A rejection of the old guard, in a way.
Seems like it. A clear signal for a different kind of leadership.
Okay, so Mamdani wins the primary, but the general election is next. People are saying it's going to be complicated, crowded, challenging. What makes it so tough, even in a heavily Democratic city?
Well, the field is unusual this year. You got the incumbent, Eric Adams, running as an independent.
Right. Adams dropped the Democratic line after his approval ratings tanked, and those corruption charges surfaced, even though they were dropped.
Exactly. So he's still in the mix. Then you have the Republican, Curtis Sliwa, who always brings a certain unpredictable element.
The Guardian Angels founder, yeah.
And a well-funded independent, Jim Walden. Plus, and this is key, Andrew Cuomo still holds an independent ballot line. He could still run in the general.
Wow. Okay, so potentially splitting the vote multiple ways. That does sound complicated.
Very. Usually the Democratic primary winner cruises in November. in NYC
Yeah.
this year. It's not so clear-cut. There's real uncertainty.
And what kind of opposition is Mamdani likely to face specifically, beyond just the other candidates?
Oh, expect fierce opposition, backed by serious money, millions of dollars. They'll hammer his relative inexperience, less than 5 years in Albany, manage a small staff. They'll question if he can run a massive city bureaucracy.
And the Israel stance will surely come up again forcefully.
Absolutely. That will be a constant line of attack, trying to paint him as too radical or out of step, especially with parts of the Jewish community.
And his policy plans, the funding.
Critics are already calling them a fantasy. Cuomo did. The argument will be that the state government, the governor, will never approve the tax hikes needed to pay for everything, that his core agenda is basically dead on arrival in Albany.
So major hurdles, even if he wins the election. Governing could be tough.
Enormously challenging, managing the huge city workforce, the agencies. And remember, he won the primary despite opposition from most unions, party leaders, editorial boards, big money interests like real estate and finance.
Right. He doesn't have the traditional establishment allies a new mayor often relies on.
Exactly. He'd be coming in as an outsider, facing entrenched resistance from day one. No honeymoon period expected. It would be a constant battle, most likely.
Let's pull the lens back again. Think about the bigger picture. How does this fit into the national landscape, especially with Donald Trump and the Republicans? We saw Trump make some surprising gains in New York State in 2024, right? 44%.
Yeah, his best showing since '88. And the shift within New York City itself was even more striking.
How so?
Well, Kamala Harris got way fewer votes than Biden did in 2020, like over 500,000 fewer. But Trump gained votes, about 95,000 more, pushing him over 30% citywide.
Over 30% for Trump in NYC. That's significant. Where did those votes come from?
That's the really interesting part. They came disproportionately from majority-minority, immigrant, working-class neighborhoods, places that are normally deep blue.
Really? Like Queens and the Bronx?
Exactly. Over 60% of his gains were there. He actually won Flushing, which is heavily Asian American, made big gains in Hispanic areas like Corona. Numbers show massive jumps in votes for him in heavily Hispanic and Black neighborhoods compared to 2020. But he actually lost votes in predominantly white areas.
So a totally counterintuitive shift.
Yeah.
What's driving that? Why would these traditionally Democratic voters swing towards Trump?
It seems to be a mix of factors. A lot of frustration over quality of life issues, crime, retail theft, drug use, the migrant situation, definitely housing costs.
The basics.
Yeah, the basics. Plus, kitchen table economics, jobs, inflation. It seems for some voters, these immediate concerns, this feeling that things aren't working, are overriding traditional party loyalty. They're responding to a different message, maybe Trump's populist promises.
And the Gaza war played a role too, didn't it? Particularly with Muslim and Arab voters.
A huge role, that historic shift you mentioned. Traditionally strong Democrats, but anger over the Biden administration's Gaza policy led many to vote for Trump or third parties. That was critical in swing states like Michigan, and you saw echoes of it even in New York. Trump actively courted those voters.
So multiple currents of dissatisfaction running through the electorate.
And this connects to a broader Republican strategy, sometimes called the war on cities. You see it playing out across the country.
How does that work?
Basically, when Democratic cities pass progressive laws, minimum wage hikes, environmental rules, whatever Republican state legislatures often step in and pass preemption laws to block them or override them.
So limiting local control.
Exactly. They frame it as fighting collectivism, but it's often about stopping policies they dislike, even if they're popular locally. It highlights this structural imbalance in U.S. politics,
Where rural, often more conservative voters have disproportionate power, especially at the state and federal level compared to urban populations.
right? Due to things like Senate representation and how districts are drawn. It makes it harder for policies favored by diverse urban majorities to get through federally.
And the GOP has invested heavily in controlling those state legislatures, right? Through things like our REBI map.
Precisely. Strategic investment in state races to control redistricting and solidify power. It's been very effective for them. Trump reaching out directly to specific voter groups, like Arab Americans in Michigan, is another tactic trying to chip away at the Democratic coalition piece by piece.
So we end up with this really fascinating kind of contradictory picture in places like New York. You've got this surge from the progressive left like Mamdani, pushing bold policies and challenging the establishment.
Right, a powerful movement from within the Democratic base.
But at the same time, you have Trump making unexpected inroads with working class, diverse communities in those same cities, tapping into a different kind of discontent focused on crime, cost of living, maybe cultural issues.
Exactly. Two very different reactions against the status quo, pulling politics in potentially opposite directions, both drawing energy from voters who feel ignored or let down by traditional politics.
It creates a really complex, maybe unstable political landscape, doesn't it?
Mm.
Where both the far left and the populist right seem to be gaining traction simultaneously.
It's incredibly dynamic. And the big question, maybe the one for you listening to think about, is how these two forces, this progressive push from cities and this populist discontent, Trump taps into, how will they continue to interact and reshape politics?
Yeah, will the established parties adapt, or will these movements fundamentally change the parties themselves, or even bypass them?
That's the key question going forward, I think. How does the system respond to these powerful currents of change?
So this is it for today.
Huh?
Hope this change will benefit the New Yorkers. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel and follow us on social media. Our handle is 8digitalco. See you in the next podcast. Keep listening.